So I'll go ahead and start the PowerPoint. Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Laura Griffin. I am the Family and Consumer Science Agent here in Pueblo County in Colorado. And today we are going to be talking about water bath canning. And so for those of you that did join us for the jams and jellies class, there is a little bit of repeat information just because jams and jellies does use the water bath canning process as well. But we're going to go through a lot of other new information as well, more related to canning fruits specifically. Okay, so essentially there are two main methods of canning. And the method that you're going to use is going to be dependent on the pH of the foods that you're trying to preserve. So the first option is water bath canning, which we'll be talking about today. And this is going to be used with acidic foods or foods with a pH of 4.6 or lower. So that's going to include most of our fruits, our pickles, our jams and jellies, and you can also water bath can tomatoes, but they do need to be acidified. So we have to add some sort of acid source to them, usually in the form of lemon juice or vinegar in order to water bath can those tomatoes. Our other type of canning is going to be pressure canning. And so pressure canning is going to be used anytime we have a neutral or low acid food, or a food with a pH of above that 4.6. So that's going to be our foods such as vegetables, meats, poultry, and fish. All right, so just a little bit of background information on that 4.6 pH number. So this is a diagram of a typical pH scale. And usually in our chemistry or biology classes, we would learn that this scale would go from 0 to 14, with 7 being neutral, so that's about the pH of water. Anything below that would be considered acidic, and anything above that would be considered alkaline or basic. But with the food preservation pH scale, that gets shifted a little bit. And so we go to that 4.6 number, and anything below that is going to be considered acidic, and anything above that 4.6 is going to be considered a low acid or basic food. And the reason that 4.6 number is so important is due to botulism. So the botulism bacteria creates a very toxic spore that can be very deadly, and it can make people very sick if they consume it. And so that 4.6 or below, that acidic environment, those spores cannot survive. So if we're canning an acidic product, as long as it's below 4.6, we don't really have to worry too much about that risk of botulism. It really can't survive in that high of acidity, but it can survive in a basic environment above that 4.6. And so with that, it's a very heat stable spore. And because of that, the temperature of water bath canning alone cannot destroy these spores. So if it's not acidic enough to not survive in that environment, we have to pressure can those foods, because that pressure canning, the pressure adds extra heat. It raises the temperature to a temperature that will destroy those potentially harmful spores. So that's a little bit of background information about the pH scale and why we have two different methods of canning and the importance of using the proper method when we're canning our different foods. All right, so just a breakdown of some of the products that we can preserve using canning. So our very highest acidic foods with a pH of around 3 are going to be our jams and jellies and conserves. So a lot of our fruit spreads. If you're new to canning, fruit spreads, jams, and jellies are a really great starting point. They are probably going to be our least risky product. So because they are very highly acidic, they're going to be our least risky for foodborne illness, and typically they're pretty simple to follow the recipe and create a good product as well. Other products that are going to be very highly acidic include apple and grape juice, and then some pickled products. So for all of these products, very highly acidic, all of them are fine to process in a water bath canner. And these are going to have our shortest processing times. So for anyone that may be processing at sea level, the processing time might be as low as 5 minutes. But I think all of us joining here today are in Colorado. So we are not going to have that shortest processing time. We will have to adjust for altitude. So that will mean that our processing time for any canned good is going to be at least 10 minutes. And so as a result of that, we don't have to sterilize our jar because we will be processing them for at least 10 minutes. And that sterilizes the jar while the processing is occurring. If for any reason you are canning anything at sea level and your processing time is less than 10 minutes, you do need to sterilize your jars before you start the process. And to do that, all you have to do is boil them hard for 10 minutes. So if you were at sea level and your processing time was less than 10 minutes, you would go ahead and boil your jars and then go ahead and fill them and process them for that 5 minutes. But like I said, I think all of us today are at altitude, so we don't have to worry about that sterilization step. All right, so some of our high acid foods with a pH of 3.4 to 4, these are going to be most of our fruit products. So we have our berries, apples, apricots, grapes, nectarines, peaches, pears, rhubarb, and again, some pickled products. Again, all of these are totally fine to process in a water bath canner, and our processing time for these are going to be a little bit longer. So we're looking at somewhere between 10 and 35 minutes at sea level. So that's going to be more like 15 to 45 minutes at elevation. And regardless of where we live, because all of our processing times are at least 10 minutes, the jars don't need to be sterilized for any of these products. All right, and then finally our kind of borderline high acid foods are going to be with a pH of 4 to 4.6. And these are going to be our tomatoes, again, that need to be acidified with either that added lemon juice or citric acid, something like that, as well as figs with the added lemon juice. So these, as long as they are acidified and you're using a reliable recipe, they can be water bath canned, and they're going to have our longest processing time of any of our water bath canned products. So we're looking at 45 to 85 minutes at sea level. Again, that's going to be a little bit longer for those of us at elevation. And they must reach a minimum internal temperature of 200 degrees Fahrenheit to destroy mildly heat-resistant spore-forming bacteria. So again, remember that the botulism spore can't survive in this high acidic environment, so we don't have to worry about that. But there are other foodborne illness causing bacteria out there, and we just want to make sure that we're bringing that to an internal temperature combined with the acidic environment to create a safe food product. And then finally, we have our low acid foods. So again, this is going to be anything with a pH of above that 4.6, including our vegetables, meats, seafood, poultry, and any products that mix some of those ingredients. So if you're doing like a chili or soup or stew, anything like that will have to be pressure canned. And that must reach an internal temperature of 240 degrees to destroy those very heat resistant bacteria. So again, that added pressure helps us to increase the temperature a little bit higher in order to help destroy some of those heat stable bacteria and spores. All right, so we are just going to dive in here to some water bath canning basics. So first, no matter what we are canning or what technique we are using, we always want to make sure that we have a tested recipe and instructions. So we always want to use up-to-date recipes and making sure that they come from a reliable source. And essentially, a tested recipe is a recipe that has been developed in either a certified food lab or some sort of university research lab, and every aspect of that recipe has been tested. So they look at not only the ratio of ingredients, but water content, pH, shelf stability, all kinds of things. They make sure that all the recipes have been adjusted properly for altitude, and that those recipes are going to not only be safe, but also a quality product for up to that year on your shelf. So we want to make sure that we're always finding a tested recipe. There are many, many recipes out there on the internet, on Pinterest, on different blogs, but you really want to make sure that you're sticking with the scientific sources, because canning improperly can become dangerous and honestly, in some cases, deadly if we are using the wrong type of method, or we're not getting enough acid, or not altitude adjusting properly. So these are some really good canning resources that are going to give you tested recipes. So first is us here at CSU Extension. So we have a certified food lab on campus, and we have a ton of great recipes on our website. We also have an app. So it's called the Preserve Smart app, and it's through CSU Extension, and you can download it to your smartphone or tablet, or you can go directly to their website and pull it up off of your computer. And it has a lot of great resources as well. And it has a function where you can actually plug in your altitude or elevation, and then it will automatically adjust all of your recipes for you. So you don't have to think about that, which is kind of nice. Another really great resource is the National Center for Home Food Preservation. So this is through the University of Georgia Extension. They do a ton of research on all things food preservation, and they have a lot of really great, not only recipes, but just resources in general. And then any other extension service is also going to be a reliable source. So if you find other state extension websites, those will be tested as well. And then there's also some recipe books available. So the So Easy to Preserve, the Ball Blue Book, the Ball Complete Book of Home Preserving, and the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning. Those are all going to be full of tested recipes as well. And don't think just because you have to use a tested recipe that you're going to be limited in what you can preserve. You know, these resources literally combine for thousands of recipes. So I'm confident that you can find a lot of great recipes that will also be safe and tested. All right, so number 2 is going to be plan time for canning. So canning is a bit of a time-consuming process, and it can be a really big undertaking, especially if it's something that you're new to, or maybe you're doing it by yourself. So you really want to make sure that you allow adequate time to complete your project. So we want to make sure that we have plenty of time, that you're not rushing, that you don't have to, you know, stop your project in the middle. Because once you start canning things, you get things hot on the stove, you start processing things. It's really hard to just kind of pause that project and run an errand, or go pick up your kid from daycare or anything like that, and just kind of leave that canning till you come back. So once the project kind of gets started, it's really hard to interrupt that. So I would say give yourself, you know, a good 4 to 6 hours, honestly, on your first attempt, because you will be starting with raw fruits or vegetables or ingredients. You'll have to prepare them. You might have to cook them. You might have to create a syrup or a brine. You'll have to fill your jars. And then again, like we saw, some of our processing times are over an hour. So once we start boiling your canner, start processing your jars, you will have to have your stove on, and you'll want to be able to supervise that for that up to 85 or 90 minutes that we have to process for. All right, number 3 is to select fresh ingredients. So obviously, we always want to start with our best quality fresh ingredient. Any type of food preservation method is going to be a little bit hard on our foods, just because we're putting them under extreme temperatures, whether that be boiling them or freezing them, or extreme pressure in the case of pressure canning. So that can take a little bit of a toll on our fruits and vegetables specifically. So by starting with that best quality fresh ingredient, that's going to give us our best quality preserved food in the end. So we always want to start with those best quality fresh fruits and vegetables. You want to rinse your fruits and vegetables, but don't soak them. So we don't want to start soaking them, making them a little bit soft, anything like that. And then peel if appropriate. And then again, if we're canning any sort of meat products or poultry, we want those to come from a healthy, fresh source as well. And we try to can our foods as quickly as possible. All right, and then number 4 is going to be assembling our equipment. So this is a pretty good list of most of what you will need to water bath can. So first, you'll need either a water bath canner or a large pot with a lid and jar rack. So in that photo there, that's pretty much the basic model of water bath canner. Those are available for purchase for under $50, so they're not a huge investment, especially if you think you'll be doing a lot of canning. They are nice because they fit the jars perfectly. They're basically designed for this project. But if you don't have a water bath canner, you don't want to invest in one, you can use basically any large stock pot, as long as it has a well-fitting lid and it's tall enough that you can put jars in it and still have 1 to 2 inches of water above the top of the jars. So any large pot with the well-fitting lid that's going to be tall enough is going to be fine. You will need to put a jar rack or something on the bottom for the jars to rest on, but you can invest in that very inexpensively from Walmart or Amazon, anything like that. You will also obviously need your jars and lids. And then these are some canning specific equipment. You can buy the next 4 items in a pack that I think is around $20. I would highly recommend investing in these things. The jar lifter is going to be that first thing we see on the bottom left corner. And this is going to help us get our jars in and out of the boiling water bath canner. So when we're putting our jars into the boiling water, just helps save our fingers a little bit. We don't have to use a washcloth or anything like that. And then when we remove our jars, not only is the water and the canner going to be hot, but the contents inside the jars are going to be boiling hot as well. So that helps to just move our jars around safely. The lid wand is going to be this little blue plastic stick with the black dot on the bottom. That dot is actually a magnet, so it helps us to pick up the lids without touching the bottom of them or maybe contaminating them, and help us place them on the jars securely. The lid wand, the bubble freer is going to be this clear opaque plastic piece here. And basically what it does is it just allows you to get around the edges of our jar to free any oxygen or air bubbles that might be loose in there before we put our lid on. And then finally we have a funnel, which this funnel just happens to fit perfectly on the top of our jars and is really nice just to kind of contain any mess, especially if you are putting something in a jar with a brine or a syrup. It can kind of direct that right into the jar. And then some other pieces of equipment you'll need, a timer, and then just other general food prep equipment. So depending on the recipe, you might need anything from a food processor or a blender to cutting boards and knives, as well as measuring cups, measuring spoons, those kinds of things. All right, so now we're going to talk about canning on a couple different types of cooktops. First up is electric cooktops. So for electric smooth top stoves or solid element burners, the canner must have a flat bottom for efficient heat transfer. So that water bath canner that I showed you, that's kind of the main model, it actually has grooves in the bottom of it. So it's not going to work very well on an electric cooktop because we really want that contact throughout the whole bottom of the pot in order to make sure that we have enough heat transfer from your stove. Another thing to really keep in mind, especially with the glass top cooktops, is that they are not all designed for canning. So some of that glass can be too sensitive and can't necessarily bear the weight of the canner full of water, the canner full of water and 8 pint-sized jars full of food. that gets to be a pretty significant amount of weight after we load our canner with our jars, with our food, with our water, and it can actually crack your glass top in some cases. So if you do have a glass top stove, we would recommend checking the manufacturer's guidelines. They should have recommendations on whether or not canning is approved for that specific model. And anytime we're canning on any type of burner, really, we want to make sure that there's no more than 4 inches past, or the diameter of the element is no more than 4 inches less than the pot or water bath canner that you're using. So again, we really want to make sure that as much as possible, we're getting that heating element directly from our burner to our pot or water bath canner. All right, so canning on induction cooktops. So induction cooktops are kind of an interesting concept. They work with a heating element that is constantly circulating in a pattern on ceramic glass. And it works using a magnetic field that transfers the heat from our cooktop to the bottom of our cookware. And so induction cooktops typically require very specific cookware. So we can only really use cast iron, 3-ply stainless steel, or carbon steel core, enamel steel, or enamel coated cast iron. Some induction cooktops are even more specific than that, and they have, one set of cookware that can be used. And if you use anything else, it's really not going to work properly. So because of this, we really don't recommend canning of any type on induction cooktops. All right, so if you have a stove that's maybe not going to work so well for canning, or you have an induction cooktop, or you just don't want to use your stove, there are a couple options. They are electric water bath canners, and these are really the main 2 models. And essentially all these are going to do are going to sit on your countertop. You plug them into your outlet, and that is how they heat up, and you can basically do all the same canning steps without a stove. So between these 2 models, there's basically 2 main differences, and that is the size and the cost. So the first is the WEC, and the WEC, it actually holds up to 20 pints at a time. So it's pretty massive. So even if you have a stove that works really well for canning, if you do a lot of canning, it might be worth the investment just because of how many jars you can do at a time. It can save you a ton of time, especially if you have something that you're canning that the processing time is, upwards of that 90 minutes. This can really help to save you a lot of time. The other option is the Ball FreshTech water bath canner. It holds 7 quarts or 8 pints. So that's, going to be a lot more in line with a typical water bath canner. But as you can see, it's like half the price. So just some things to keep in mind. Those options are available. And then we also have this line from Ball called the automatic home canners. So they have this product, which is the automatic home canner for water bath canning. They also have an automatic jam and jelly maker. So these products are kind of interesting because they're totally pre-programmed. So, they'll tell you every step of the way what ingredients you need to add, when you need to add your jars. The timers are already preset. The altitude adjustments are preset. So it takes a little bit of the guesswork out of things. You don't have to, pay attention to the recipe or altitude adjustments quite as much. But they're also very limiting. So they're only going to be suitable for recipes specifically developed for these appliances. So you'll get a recipe book with these. I think they might have maybe 20 or 25 recipes in them, and that's all that you can use for them. So this one's about $300. The jam and jelly one I don't think is quite that expensive, but they are options that are available. You know, personally, I don't know that it's worth the investment, but it is a product that is an option. All right, so our jars, we can basically use, you know, any regular mason type glass jar. And the nice thing about the jars is that they can be reused as many times as they stay in good condition. So every season when we get our jars out, we want to just kind of quickly inspect them, make sure that there's no cracks, that there's no chips around the ring or anything. But as long as they're in good shape, they can continue to be reused. We also want to make sure that we're starting off with clean jars. So before we do any canning, we want to just, you know, wash those out with hot soapy water, or just go ahead and run them through the dishwasher. Again, at our altitude, we don't have to sterilize our jars because everything is going to be processed for at least 10 minutes. So we get that sterilization during our processing time. If you do any canning at a lower elevation and you have a processing time of less than 10 minutes, then you would want to do that sterilization step. And as far as jars go, all of the recipes should say what size jars the recipes are for. So you can use those sizes listed in the recipe, and you can also use smaller jars. So if you use a smaller jar, you still want to process for that same full amount of time, but you can go smaller, but you never want to go larger. So if it says pints, you know, we can go to half pints, but we don't want to go up to a quart size jar. All right, and then the lids. So we're using a 2-piece lid that includes the self-sealing metal disc and then our screw band. So for the metal disc lid part, that can only be used once. So once we put that lid on our jar, we process it, it seals, and then we open it and eat the contents. That lid will get discarded because it won't seal again. But the screw band, it, just like the jar, can be used as many times as it stays in good condition. So when we're starting our project for the year, just like with the jars, we want to just take a quick look at our screw bands, make sure that, you know, there's not any rust occurring, there's not any big dents or chips or anything out of those as well. And those can be reused as long as they're in good condition. And then with the lids, we want to follow the manufacturer's directions for preparing lids for use. So typically on our box of jar lids, it's going to say one of two things. It's either going to say to heat the lids just below a simmer until ready to use, or it's going to say that there's no preparation required and that you can just use the lids. So those are kind of our two main directions right now. A lot of the lids are going to the no preparation required. But personally, I find even the lids that say they don't require any prep, if you do heat them up in just a small saucepan before you use them, they tend to seal a lot better. So I don't know if that's just my random luck, but that's kind of been my observation. I always just throw them in a small saucepan and heat them up a little bit before I use them. All right, so now we're going to go through the steps to water bath canning. So before we get started, we always want to start by filling up our canner about halfway with hot water. And so like I said, we're going to need our canner to have enough water in it that the jars are covered with about 1 to 2 inches of water when they're fully submerged. So depending on the size of your canner, depending on the size of your jars, you might not have to fill it quite halfway. You might have to fill it more than halfway. But filling it halfway is a good starting point, and then you kind of eyeball it from there. But we want to go ahead and get some hot water in there. Go ahead and cover it and turn it on the stove to start preheating it, because typically this is a large amount of water and it does take quite a while to get that to a full boil. So that's always step one to kind of get that started. The next step is going to be to heat our jars. So you have a couple options here, but it's important that our jars are at least a little bit warm when we fill them with our food, because more than likely we're going to be filling our jars with a very hot, if not boiling, food or liquid. And so if we put a very hot food product into a very cold jar, that can cause breakage of the glass. And so that causes a mess, waste some of our food that we prepared. So we just want to make sure that that doesn't happen. So we can always just heat our jars by go ahead and placing them in the canner itself. So while the canner and that water is heating up, the jars will heat up as well. So that's always an easy way to do it. Another option would be a couple hours before you want to start your food preservation process. You can go ahead and put all your jars and just run them through the dishwasher. And once the dishwasher finishes, just keep the door closed. Dishwashers are pretty well insulated. It holds in that heat pretty well. And once you're ready to start filling your jars, then you can go ahead and open that dishwasher and remove one jar at a time. So those are a couple different options just to make sure that our jars are a little bit heated up before we start putting food into them. And then of course, we're going to prepare our lids to package directions. So like I said, I typically just go ahead and put them in a saucepan like you see here at the bottom of the screen, and heat them up a little bit either way. So it doesn't take too long, and I find that it works a little bit better. All right, so once we've got all of our equipment ready to go and prep work done, basically all we're gonna do is prepare our recipe following the instructions given. So this can look very different depending on the type of food that you are canning. Some foods like this we see here has a lot of different ingredients. So we're gonna be chopping up different ingredients. We're going to be adding vinegar, we're going to be adding a salt, and we're going to be measuring out different ingredients and combining them on a stovetop. Some things might be as simple as just chopping up or having a few fruits or vegetables and placing them in the jar as a raw pack. So it really is recipe dependent. So if you take one thing away from this class today, really just following the recipe is super, super important in canning. Making sure that you have a good quality tested recipe first off, and that you're following it explicitly. So we don't want to be making changes to the recipe, adding ingredients, subtracting ingredients, especially if they are like an acidic source, such as vinegar, lemon juice, things like that. We never want to be changing the size of the jar to go any larger. We don't want to change the processing time. We just really want to be aware of that recipe and making sure that we're following it explicitly. All right, so there's two main ways that we can process our water bath can products. So we have a hot pack and a raw pack. And basically the hot pack, like it sounds, we're going to be packing the food hot. So we're going to bring our food to a boil, simmer it for a few minutes, and then pack it in our jars while it's still warm. And I would say this is probably the method that we will see on 75% of the recipes. It's our typical water bath canning method. There's several advantages to it. First, because we cook that food down a little bit first, it's going to allow us to get more food in our jar. It's also going to have less oxygen in our jar, which is going to give us better color and better nutrient retention. And because we're able to pack it a little bit tighter, not only are we going to get more food in each jar, but we're also less likely to get that food that floats to the top. So just from a presentation standpoint, that always looks a little bit nicer and gives us a little bit more food in each jar. So because of this, typically this is going to be our preferred packing style for water bath canned goods. But there are some recipes out there that call for a raw pack. And this, just like it sounds, we're packing those foods in the jars raw without cooking them or heating them first. The main probably advantage to this is time, because we don't have to take that time to prepare the food on the stovetop. We can just go ahead and place it directly in our jars. But the results are going to be less food in each jar. The fruit or food might float more, and that trapped air can cause discoloration during storage. So there's just a little bit of information on the two packing styles. And then back to our process. So after we have prepared our recipe as the instructions state, and we're ready to start filling our jars, we're going to go ahead and remove our jars either from the hot water bath or from our dishwasher. And we're going to start filling our jars one at a time with that food that we have prepared. So again, this can look different depending on the type of food that you are preserving. So some of them may be, you know, just filling it with something such as applesauce. So it's a very consistent texture and you're just going to fill your jar. Some things you might be doing peaches in a sugar syrup solution. So then you'll have to fill with your peaches and then pour your syrup over the top. But either way, we always want to make sure that we are leaving the proper headspace, which again should be stated in your tested recipe. And headspace is basically the amount of space between the top of the jar and the top of where the food is in the jar. And headspace is important because we do want to allow for expansion during processing. So if that expansion space is not available, that can cause our jars to crack or break. Typically, the recipe should say what the headspace would be, but as a general rule of thumb, our jams and jellies and fruit spreads are going to be about a 1/4 inch. Our other water bath canned goods, so our juices, our fruits, our pickles, things like that, will be a 1/2 inch. And then anything being pressure canned is typically going to be 1 inch. And there's a couple different ways that you can measure this headspace. So the first is in that equipment that we talked about earlier, the bubble freer. That basically is just a smooth kind of spatula on one side that helps to release any of that oxygen or air bubbles. On the other side of it, it has a measurement device to measure headspace. So you can use that if you have that piece of equipment. But if not, you can use the jar as a guide. So as we can see here, each of those little rings is giving us a measurement. So the first ring from the top is going to be about a 1/4 inch. The second one is going to be about a 1/2 inch. And then the shoulder of the jar is going to be about 1 inch. So you can use that as a guide if you don't have the bubble freer and headspace measure available. All right, so speaking of the bubble freer, so after you have your food placed in the jar and we've measured for headspace, we want to remove any air bubbles by just gently sliding either a rubber spatula or the back of a spoon or the bubble freer around the jar, gently agitating the food and the liquid. You should see little bubbles starting to come up from the top. And that's a good sign that those air bubbles are being released, that oxygen is getting out of your jar, and that this process is working. Sometimes when you do this, it changes the height of the food in the jar. So after you do your bubble freeing, you always want to double check your headspace measurement. So sometimes you'll want to add a little bit more food after you've done the bubble freeing. And then after you've double checked all of that, we want to take either a damp paper towel or clean cloth and just really wipe down all of our rings and our rim really well before we put our lid on. Because, you know, we've gone through hours and hours of prep and work to make sure that we have all of these different products that are hopefully going to last us through the year. So we want to make sure that as many of these jars as we can will seal properly. And so any little piece of gunk or sticky residue on that jar, especially the rim, can cause an issue with that seal. So we want to make sure that we wipe that down really well and make sure that there's not going to be any issues with our lid and our seal. All right, so then we can use our lid wand, which we see there, to take one lid and place it directly on the top of the jar. And again, we want to make sure that we are not contaminating the bottom of the lid or the top of the rim of the jar with anything that could cause an issue with our seal. So we want to lift that with the lid wand, try not to touch the bottom of it, try not to put it down on the counter, and put it straight onto our jar. And then we'll go ahead and take our screw band and adjust it until it is fingertip tight. So that is a kind of canning verbiage, but essentially it just means light enough, it's tight enough that you can unscrew it easily with just a fingertip touch. So we don't want to put this screw band on and crank it on really tight, because if we do that, sometimes the pressure inside the jar can actually cause the lid to buckle over the screw band, and then there's no way to get it off. So you've wasted all the food inside the jar, you've wasted the jar, you now have to throw away the lid and the screw band. So all of that is lost if that happens. So always err on the side of looser rather than tighter. You know, the screw band doesn't serve any purpose other than to hold the lid in place until it is processed. So it doesn't need to be on there super tight to keep the lid in place. All right, so once our lid is on, our screw band is in place, then we're going to go ahead and start loading our jars into the canner. And again, making sure that we don't disrupt that seal in any way. Once our jars are loaded and good to go, we want to disturb them as little as possible throughout the rest of the process. So we'll take our jar lifter like we see here in this photo, and we want to try to lift it straight up, straight over, and straight down into the canner without tilting as much as possible. So again, we don't want to jostle it, we don't want to turn it on its side, because that can get that food particle or that liquid or that sticky residue under the lid and cause an issue with our seal. So we're going to load all of our jars. Like we see there on the photo, you do want that jar rack that either comes with that canner or some sort of jar rack in your pot that you are using as a canner. And making sure that that water then covers the jars by 1 to 2 inches. So this is the time if we need to add more water, we can go ahead and do that. And then we're ready to start processing. So hopefully our water is pretty warm by this point because we've been letting it heat up while we've been doing all of these other steps. But likely it's probably not at a full rolling boil yet. So we're going to put our food and our jars in the canner. We're going to put the lid on the canner, and then we're going to turn it up all the way to high, and we're going to wait until it's at a full rolling boil. So sometimes this can take a little bit of time, but you want to make sure that it is at that full boil before we start our timer for our processing time. So that processing time is specifically for a full rolling boil. If we just go ahead and put our jars in, the water's kind of warm and it's heating up and we start our processing time, then we're shortchanging our processing time, and that can cause food safety issues. So we can check our water bath canner periodically. Once it is at that rolling boil, then we can go ahead and start our processing time. And again, this can vary pretty drastically depending on what you're canning specifically. So if it's a jam or a jelly, it's likely just going to be 10 minutes and then you can go ahead and remove it. If you're doing something like pickles or tomatoes, then it could be up to 90 minutes or longer. So it's very dependent on your specific recipe that you're using. All right, altitude adjustments for water bath canning. Altitude adjustments are super important for food safety in both types of canning, but for boiling water bath canning specifically, how we adjust for altitude is by adding processing time. So we want to make sure that we know our exact elevation that we will be canning at so that we know the appropriate adjustments to make. So if you're in Pueblo County, we are around 4,600 feet. And so we would want to make a note of that, make sure we're following that in our recipes. If you are in other parts of Colorado, hopefully you know your elevation already. If not, there's some websites out there such as whatismyelevation.com or geoplaner.com, and then you can look up your elevation and use that as a reference within your recipes. If you find a recipe that doesn't have altitude adjustments, that's a really good sign that it has not been tested and that it might not be safe, and we would not recommend using it. If you live over 10,000 feet of elevation, we have not found any safe tested recipes for that high of an elevation either. So if you're above 10,000 feet, unfortunately, canning is not a good option, but there are other food preservation options out there, such as dehydrating or freezing. All right, so after our processing time has gone the full time at the rolling boil, we can go ahead and turn off our heat, remove the lid, and then just wait, 5 or 10 minutes before trying to remove the jars. Let everything sort of cool down a little bit, let the steam dissipate, and then we can take our jar lifter again. And just like when we loaded the canner, we want to unload it the same way with disrupting our jars as little as possible. So try not to tilt them or jostle them or anything like that. We're going to lift them straight out of the canner, straight over, and straight down onto either a towel, a cooling rack, or a cutting board. And the reason for this is the same reason why we wanted to heat up our jars. When we remove our jars from the canner, the contents and the jar are very, very hot. And so if we put that very, very hot glass jar on a cool kitchen counter, then that can cause breakage of the jar because of the temperature difference. So just by putting down something as simple as a dish rag, it's going to avoid that potential problem. All right, so once you have your jars unloaded, basically we're just waiting for them to seal. So some of these jars will start sealing immediately. Like you'll take the lid off the canner and you'll start to hear those pings. You'll start to see those indents on those jar lids and they seal right away. Some of them literally won't seal for 12 to 24 hours. It just kind of depends. Don't give up hope if you take all your jars out and you're not hearing those pings and you feel like none of them are going to seal. I've gone many times, left them overnight, come back, and the majority of them have sealed. So sometimes it just takes a little bit of time. So we want to just try to leave them alone overnight, 12 to 24 hours, and then come back and check them. When you take them out of the canner, because we are erring on the side of loose rather than tight with those screw bands, sometimes they've become even more loose during the processing. Don't retighten them, don't mess with them, they're fine. Just leave them be. And then when we come back in that 12 to 24 hours, we can start checking our seals. And so what we're looking for is that concave piece in the middle of the lid. So it should be basically dipped down in the center of the lid. So we can kind of look at it eye level. If you want to look down at your countertop, you can kind of see that indent typically. You can also gently rub your finger over the top of the jar lids and you can feel for that indent as well. We want to be careful pressing down on them too hard because sometimes if you press down on a lid in the center, it'll actually stay depressed, but it wasn't actually sealed. So sometimes if we do that, our finger actually sealed it and it just didn't pop back up, but it's not actually sealed on its own. So then we're going to put it in our pantry and then it's going to go bad over that time while it's sitting there. So we just want to make sure that we're not sealing it, that it's sealing by itself. So after they are sealed and cooled and good to go for long-term storage, we actually want to remove the screw bands. So like I said, the screw bands serve no function other than just keeping that lid in place during processing. So if you're, going to be transferring them or giving them as gifts, the screw band can kind of help in transport, or just to make them look a little nicer. If you want to put ribbon around it or fabric underneath it or something, that's fine. But for storage at home, I would just go ahead and remove them. It makes it a lot easier to tell if for some reason a seal breaks in your pantry, then that screw band is not holding it in place, and you can tell a lot easier that that seal has been broken. So we'll remove our screw bands. We'll wash the outside of the jars if there's any sticky residue or anything on the outside of the jar. And then we'll go ahead and label the top of the jar. So we want to label the lid typically, so we can reuse the jar and we can see on the top what's in there. So we want to label with the contents, so what it is, if it has any specific ingredients in it that may be allergy related or anything like that, the method that you used, and then a date. So typically best quality is going to be used within a year. So you can either put the date that you process them on and know that you need to use them by a year from then, or you can kind of put an expiration date on there and say best if used by a year from the date that you process them. So that's up to you how you want to label that, but we typically want to use these within a year. The color, the nutrient level, everything starts to go down after that. And then just like any other canned good, you'll go ahead and store in a cool, dry, and dark place. So I've talked a lot about sealing of the jars, and sometimes jars don't seal. So that is just the fact of canning. It happens to the best of us, and sometimes we have no idea why. Sometimes we have one jar that just doesn't happen to seal. Sometimes half of our jars don't seal. And so that can be probably one of the most frustrating parts of canning, but we want to try to take every precaution to ensure that that doesn't happen. If you do have jars that don't seal, you can reprocess them within 24 hours. So within 24 hours, essentially all you're going to do is replace the lid with a new lid, process it for the full amount of time again, and then again, give it that 12 to 24 hours and see if it seals. So in some cases, if it's just one or two jars, sometimes it's a lot easier just to go ahead and put those in the refrigerator and eat those first and put the rest of them in the pantry for long-term storage. Depending on the product and how long the processing time is, it can start to get pretty hard on our foods. So for example, tomatoes, if we've already processed them for 90 minutes, they're probably going to be a little bit soft to begin with. If we process them for another 90 minutes, the texture is definitely going to be affected. So likely we're going to start to get kind of soupy tomatoes. So depending on what you're using them for, you may or may not care. If you're going to grind them up for tomato sauce anyway, then it might be totally fine and you'd rather reprocess them. If you're going to use them for something else, then again, maybe better just to put them in the refrigerator and try to use those first. But if the jar hasn't sealed and we haven't refrigerated and we haven't reprocessed within 24 hours, then that food needs to get discarded. All right, so some processes not recommended for canning. The internet is an incredible place with a lot of very creative ideas on canning. So I guarantee you can find recipes using all of these different techniques, but we would highly recommend staying away from any of those. So first we have open kettle canning. This one's pretty commonly used, I would say. Essentially, it just uses the heat of the food that you cook to put in the jar, and then they put the lid on, and it uses that heat from the food to seal the jar. Sometimes they flip the jar over to help create a seal, but first of all, the seal is going to be a lot weaker than if it was actually processed in an open kettle or in a water bath canner. And second of all, the temperatures obtained are not going to be high enough to destroy all of those potentially foodborne illness causing microorganisms. So we want to make sure that we're doing that full processing. Open kettle canning can kind of feel like a shortcut sometimes, but not a good idea. These are all kind of interesting. oven, microwave, and dishwasher processing. So again, you can find recipes for any of these online, but none of them are tested, none of them are altitude adjusted, and they do not prevent the risk of those potential spoilage microorganisms. The next one's kind of interesting, the electric power pressure cookers, because pressure cookers, you know, the Ninja brand, the Instant Pot, they have all become really, really popular in the last few years. And a lot of them claim that they can be used as a pressure canner. They come with instructions for canning, they come with recipes for canning, but based on the USDA's definition of a pressure canner, these cookers do not meet the recommendations and they're not considered safe. So for a pressure canner to work properly, it has to be a certain size and it has to have a certain thickness of metal around the outside. So if you have a pressure cooker, a pressure canner, excuse me, or you've seen one, they're very hefty. They weigh a lot, they're very thick, and the pressure cookers just don't meet those requirements. And the different sizes of the pressure cookers, they're a lot smaller. And so the pressure, the way that they come to pressure and decrease in pressure is going to be a lot different than the pressure canner itself. And we've had multiple discussions with some of these brands. None of the recipes have been altitude adjusted or tested. So especially living here in Colorado, we do not recommend using pressure cookers for canning purposes. Some other processes not recommended, the paraffin or wax seals. These are another one that are kind of, people feel like it's a shortcut and it's pretty commonly used because again, you don't have to actually process in the water bath canner. You just heat up wax, pour that over the top of the jar, and it supposedly seals your product. But many tests have shown that the seal is not a full seal. It allows mold and bacteria to get into those products, contaminate them, all kinds of good stuff. I have personally seen peach jam with a paraffin wax seal, and it was like blue. So please don't use wax seals. And then finally, we have glass and zinc caps and the Tattler lids. These are all basically reusable canning lids. They work a little bit differently than our metal rings, and you know, to be totally honest, they just don't really work all that well. So while they are reusable, they're difficult to work with. They're difficult to get a good seal. Some of them are difficult to tell if they're sealed properly. So I would recommend, you know, you can reuse the jars, you can reuse the screw bands, but just reinvest in those lids every year. It's a very minimal cost. It's a very minimal amount of waste every year. So I would just use those metal lids each year. All right, so some signs of spoilage. So incorrectly processed low acid foods can be spoiled even if it appears normal. So this is another reason why it's just very important that we're using the proper type of canning and that we're following those tested recipes really well. Because, you know, botulism, those toxins don't necessarily give out a lot of warning. They're not creating different colors or odors or anything like that. But if you do see any signs of spoilage, typically that's going to come in the form of cloudy canning liquid or an off color. Sometimes this cloudy canning liquid can be from spoilage. Sometimes it might just be from your tap water if you use that in a recipe. So it can be a little bit tricky to tell sometimes. If you ever have questions about things like this, you can always call your local extension office. We can kind of talk you through, you know, the recipe you used, the type of products that you used, and if we think it's a good idea to keep that product or if we think it might be a better idea to just discard it. Obviously, if we have any strange odor, if we have any mold growth, or if that jar is visibly not sealed when you go back to grab it out of the pantry, those would all be reasons to discard that food. All right, so hopefully this has inspired you all to get involved in water bath canning. Yes, you can. like I said, the biggest takeaway from this class I hope you get is just to really make sure that you're using a reliable recipe and that you're following it really closely. If you have any questions at any time, you can always give me a call or shoot me an email. You can also contact your local extension agent and they should be able to help you as well. So with that, I will go ahead and take any questions. If you want to put them in the chat or if you want to go ahead and ask them out loud, either way is fine. All right, so it looks like our only question so far is always use new lids, don't reuse lids. So yes, definitely, once they seal that first time, we can't reuse them. I know some resources out there will tell you that you can reuse them, and sometimes they'll have a weak seal the second time, but we would highly recommend investing in new lids each time. And especially living in Colorado here, a lot of the canning production sites are at sea level. So when they ship us our canned goods, like if we buy a brand new pallet of jars, they'll come with lids and screw bands. But a lot of those lids actually seal in transport because of the pressure difference as they come to altitude. So if you buy new jars and you take the lid off of one and it kind of pops off and gives you some resistance, it's possible that that lid has actually already sealed to the jar and it's not going to seal again when you process it. So I always recommend starting with brand new lids, even if there's new lids on the jars that you just bought. All right, any other questions? All right, well, thank you all for joining us. Like I said, you will be receiving a follow-up email by the end of the week that will have all the slides we went over today. And it will also have a link to this recording if you guys want to go back and watch any of it again or get any clarity on anything. That will be available to you on YouTube for 30 days after it's posted. So thank you guys so much. I hope to see some of you in a couple weeks for our pressure canning class.